All right, this is Generous Theology with Chuck and Brock, and it is a joy to be here. Chuck, my friend, we have the honor and the privilege of being in a really crucial chapter in Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, the first volume, the volume on Prolegomena. We're in part 3, the foundations of dogmatic theology, and we're in chapter 7, the scientific foundations. And we're in a section called rationalism. And the kind of material that Bavinck has put in these two lectures, in paragraph 64 and paragraph 65. And I think that's my understanding roughly of how the material came to be in the dogmatic. I think these were Bavinck's notes from his lecture sessions. And I think roughly speaking, the paragraphs typically coincided with a lecture. And in this case, this one particular lecture in this section on rationalism, paragraph 64, could be, Chuck, this could be a graduate level course unpacking this and working it profitably. And I don't mean to say that just meaning that Bavinck is speaking in a high philosophical, high theological sense that only, quote unquote, the educated can get something useful here. I mean it in another sense, in a sense that this section and this chapter is in some sense a master key. I think if a person were to give this chapter its due and really read and really internalize the perspective Bavinck is giving, then I honestly think this is one of those seminal sections that would just set you up for life in terms of having a solid perspective to not only be able to understand Reformed dogmatics and the principles underneath it, but also to be able to say something about some of the other competing schools of thought. And that's valuable beyond measure. I'm very hard-pressed. Maybe one or two other Reformed dogmaticians have material engaging with modernity in such a mature way. And so that's the opening salvo. Chuck, if it's all right, let me press into this chapter. And I'm going to read a lot of this chapter, this section, because Bavinck is just so good here. And we're just going to walk through it together a little bit. And we're in a section now on rationalism. And Bavinck opens by saying this: science always consists in a logical relation between subject and object. Our view of science depends on the way we relate the two. At all times, there have been two basic schools of thought that were diametrically opposed to each other in this respect: rationalism and empiricism. So, Chuck, remember our arch of Aristotelian logic that we talked about in our Bavinck sessions maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. And we talked about the St. Louis arch. And if you imagine a human mind up at the top of the St. Louis arch, and the mind coming and making its connection to the ground through the two different sides of the arch, then you get a really good sense here of how we can consider rationalism and empiricism. So you have the human mind at the top of the St. Louis arch, and coming down from one side, you have rationalism. And then coming down on the other side, you have empiricism. Now, we're going to talk first about rationalism. That's what this section is about. So we're going down the Aristotelian arch, the St. Louis arch, as it were. And as we go down, we're going to find that if we understand this, almost all of Western philosophy will gravitate toward one or the other of these two schools. And so there's great benefit here. Now, let's start down the side of the arch called rationalism. Now, Bavinck says the two schools, rationalism and empiricism, surfaced already in Greek philosophy. So you go back to the Geisteswissenschaft and you go back to the liberal humanities, and they always love to start inquiries into knowledge in the Greeks. And Bavinck respects that here. And he points out that even within the Greek setting, there was always this tension between these two schools going all the way back. And so the two building blocks that dominate here, on one side, on the rationalism side, you have this idea of thought. And then on the empiricism side, you have this idea of sense perception. Now, we're going to get to the sense perception. We're going to get to the empiricism. But I think in this discussion session, we're going to get to focus on the other side. Now, Parmenides, Plato, the Neoplatonists, Bavinck notes, come down on this rationalistic side. Now, here, what is a rationalism? Well, Bavinck says this. It's the idea that sense perception yields no knowledge because it is focused on changing phenomena. Sense perception only teaches us that something is and is a certain way or is such, but not why it is such. And so in terms of explanatory power, rationalists are going to look very critically at empiricists. And they're going to say that our senses often deceive us. They often give us false ideas, and ideas that can be cleansed of their untruth only by thinking. Now, here's the crux. Accordingly, thinking is far superior to sense perception. And Bavinck puts it this way. Only thinking yields knowledge. Scientific knowledge does not come from without. It is a product of the human mind. Now, Chuck, that's a very stark point. And I think if there's a helpful, intuitive way to think about this, it's the idea that in some abstract or academic sense, Chuck, you and I ultimately have knowledge, make sense of reality, come to an explanation of how things are, only because we ultimately, to some degree, think of what's the famous sculpture, The Thinker? That gentleman there is sitting down and he's thinking in a very contemplative position. And to the degree that any human will ultimately have knowledge, the thinker gives us this idea that there's this computer turning up inside of our heads. There's this thinking machine. There's this wheel that's turning and the crank is turning and inputs are being churned and out are going to come outputs. And that's really what knowledge is going to be. And it's nothing else. And we're going to get into some of what the other else's might be. But if one is a rationalist, then ultimately one is really committed to a very intense view. And let me throw that over to you, Chuck. When you think about rationalism, when you think about the kinds of things that are associated with it, what comes to your mind and what were you thinking about in reading these early paragraphs in this section?
Well, certainly, a few things that come to mind here. First of all, just beginning with the fact that we draw this right, between rational empiricism. But as you correctly point out, by describing the St. Louis Arch, the Aristotelian Arch, there is a sense in which you have both at all times, right? There is probably no one who is entirely a rationalist and finds no place for empirical knowledge. Similarly, there is probably no one who is a pure empiricist and finds no place for any kind of rational thinking. But there certainly are people who fall somewhere along the arch that, if you've ever, since you've used the St. Louis Arch here, if you've ever been up the St. Louis Arch, you know that you actually can get in at one end and you ride this egg-shaped car that starts at the bottom and goes up to the top, and you look around and you get out and you look around from the top and then you get back in and you go back down. And as I recall, it's only on one side. You can't go up from both sides. But let's just pretend there was. It seems to me that where most people are is not back down on the ground and probably not right up at the peak either. But most people have gotten in and then stopped the little car somewhere along the side of the arch. And that's where they've decided to make their stand as the ideal place for their philosophy. And so that's one piece here. But certainly, even as we do that, it is very helpful to see that you do have these two somewhat opposing legs. I was thinking about that as well, and just thinking about, well, are there alternatives to realism or empiricism? And I think there are, but in some ways, given that what we are talking about is an arch with things in between, you'd almost have to have it along a different axis, and that's not the axis that whether modern or even pre-modern folks really think along. I think, perhaps you have a sense in which you could think about some kind of mysticism where true knowledge is gained only by some kind of transcendent or divine experience. I think there is a sense in which sometimes modern philosophers try to put Christians into sort of this mystic realm and then dismiss it as being off to the side and meaningless. To some extent, I think that there is missing in this arch that appeal to the transcendent. And, if we're going to create a model I'm not sure it would look like a third leg to the arch. I think rather there'd be probably some, more overall involved in the overall arch, where there might be some level of not necessarily mysticism, but some sort of, place for the transcendent. I think the other option is a radical skepticism. And it does seem like that perhaps radical skepticism is, well, again, I don't know that there's anybody who is entirely a radical skeptic. Nothing could possibly be known. Nothing could possibly exist, because even a radical skeptic is going to live in some ways as if that you can rely on certain things. They're not going to not move because they don't think gravity is going to keep working, or they think they're going to fall through the crust of the earth or something like that. But it does seem that there may be a growing move towards some form of radical skepticism in postmodern thought. But so that was the other piece as I was thinking about this is there something else besides rationalism, empiricism? And those are really all that I could come up with. Finally, there is in some of our discussions, we've talked a little bit about how there are those who criticize Bavinck for being too tied up in a synthetic Kantian way of thinking. And, perhaps by some of those people may say, well, look, this is what he does. He presents rationalism and empiricism as the primary options. He doesn't really talk about any form of transcendence. And even when we get into the section on realism, which I think is really important, and we talk about things like universals and specifics and in that sort of setting, he still is speaking in this language of the rationalists and the empiricists, that Kantian language. But again, my thinking here is that to me, that's not a sign that somehow Bavinck has sold out to the modernists and is well on his way to, towards a liberal modernist way of thinking. But rather, I think what he's doing here is he's speaking in language that can be understood. And it is important to note that, after a fairly lengthy section in which Bavinck does deal very much with theology and with religious dogma, here he has really dived into philosophy, into the specific discipline of philosophy. And it really takes until the end of each section where he maybe brings in a little bit of where were Christian thinkers going. And then when he gets into this section on realism, he dives in a little more, especially Augustine. But yeah, I don't think that that's a problem with Bavinck. I don't think it means that he's sort of come this thinker that has given into this syncretic urge to Christianity with pagan thought. Rather, I think what he's doing is speaking language that people will understand. And to some extent, as you noted, these were his lectures that he was giving in his classes. I think he was also providing somewhat of a language lesson to his students. I can't remember now off the top of my head whether these were all lectures that he gave at Kampen, but certainly at the time that he was professor at Kampen, he was, dealing with students who were not necessarily caught up in that modernist way of thinking. They were often coming from the more pietist side of the Dutch Reformed Church, the more pietist side of the breakoffs from the Dutch Reformed Church. And, there's a sense in which, he needed to school some of these students in the ways that the modernists think. And so I think, frankly, a lot of what he says here is something that we can still learn from today as we try to understand the way modernists are thinking. What do you think? Am I being too generous to Bavinck? Am I being fair to Bavinck? Or am I being maybe not generous enough to the critics of Bavinck? What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. I love the build out, first of all. I agree with you. And that's how it appears to me as well. It's a very interesting thing that Bavinck is a university professor that is somewhat in the tradition of the new liberal arts and humanities that he is ultimately criticizing. And we have to ask, what does that make him? And the answer is subtle, it's nuanced, and it's complex. Now, first of all, the Geisteswissenschaften folks, the liberal humanities folks, don't claim Bavinck. They don't own him as one of their own. And so for a critic to say that Bavinck is a modern compromiser, when the moderns themselves view Bavinck's foundationalism with, as if not outright enmity, as representative of the thing that the liberal humanities had conquered as a part of the pre-modern way. And it's a really rough thing for critics of Bavinck to say that he was corrupted by modernity, because there are no moderns who own him. There are no moderns who say, he's our boy. He's not on the field wearing the uniform of the moderns, even though he teaches in a modern university setting. And so I think we have to keep that in mind. Secondly, is that Bavinck dogmatically is always going to come back to the orthodoxy of the pre-moderns. He's a genuine descendant of the Protestant Calvinism of Luther and Calvin, developed through the centuries, of course, influenced in his own home nation of the Netherlands. And I think we have to respect that. So as a modern, let me step back. One of my concerns for our dear Reformed friends is many of our friends have decided that they will oppose modernity, and now even to some degree post-modernity. They want to oppose it by anathematizing it, by making it something that is forbidden to even speak about, except in the most vitriolic of ways. And Chuck, I think you and I represent a contrast to that. And so I think where many, if not most, of our Reformed brothers are just going to focus perhaps on the scholastic side of the pre-modern times. Think here of the Reformed classical scholasticism movements of our day, this return to evil thought that's embraced. In contrast to that, I think we are doing a very Bavinck-like thing in our day, you and I, by, first of all, we take a lot of efforts to be solidly confessionally grounded. And then on top of that, we live in a modern and postmodern world. Now, that means that to some degree we are corrupted. If one takes corruption to mean influenced by, exposed to, and using the vocabulary of modernity and postmodernity. However, I think there's more to it than that. And I don't think that's a fair way to characterize things, because I think it's a rough choice to take such a harsh action. I find that in some sense, I myself am a child of modernity, not theologically, and of course not consciously, but so much of what I know and understand and believe to be true is a build-out of, it's a modern build-out. And it's even to some degree a postmodern build-out. Now, how can that be? Well, there's this idea, Chuck, that it's not only the secularists who participated in the modern situation, but modernity has a history of interacting with Christians as well. And you and I find ourselves thrown in that mix. And so even if we, Chuck, could go back into our monastery and only read Latin and only study Aristotle and be scholastic, I don't think that would necessarily improve our situation in terms of interacting in the culture we live in. And so that's my criticism for many of our dear brothers who have anathematized any participation at all. And so that's a brief thought and foray into that. We're going to get more into Bavinck's rationalism here, Chuck, but I just wanted to step back and touch base with you and see what you thought about that answer, because, it's important to me. I'm very concerned that people would not think we're seeking to be compromisers, or we're seeking to betray or go over to the enemy or incorporate the enemy's methods into our theology, is oftentimes accused. So how does that hit you?
I agree with you. There is a sense in which we are affected by the world around us. We even though we may not be of the world, we are still in the world, right? To turn around the saying is often from Scripture. So if we are of the world, even if we are not in the world per se, that means that we're going to use the language oftentimes of the world as a way of helping to explain things and explain our perspectives, which may be very much not of the world, but, of the kingdom instead. But the fact that we use that language does not somehow make us now of the world. It may, being in the world, we have to use that kind of language in order to be understood. If we were to not use language that would make us understood, we would we'd be failing in the task that we've been given to go out into the world and make disciples. And I'm sure there are some who say, well, go do that in some other way. You don't need to be studying philosophy. You don't need to be studying the depths of dogmatics to do it. But certainly there are people who can go into the world and make disciples in other ways. But I also think we are all members of a body, and we're all different parts. We all have different roles, and there is a role. Philosophers, there is a role for academics, for people who think deeply about these philosophical issues of what do we know and how do we know it, and what is thinking, and what are we perceiving? There is a role for all that, because that is part of the created order that God has created, and we're existing in that created order. I think we're probably going to get a little bit more into that when we get into Bavinck's discussion of realism, which really in some ways becomes his alternative to the Aristotelian arch, but he's still going to use a lot of that language of the Aristotelian arch in describing realism. So yeah, I understand why some people may be concerned. There is a sense in which sometimes it is possible to not fully realize one's own captivity to the ways of the world. And, there are those who would say you just need to avoid, that captivity in any way possible. But I guess I just don't go that far in that direction. My thought is that the way that we live in the world but not of it is to recognize that does mean being in the world and use the language of the world. And that's what Bavinck does here. And so, yeah, I'm in full agreement with you and understand where some of those concerns are. But in the end, perhaps, quite strongly, in fact, would argue that those who criticize Bavinck in this way have just not quite gotten it right.
Amen, my friend. Amen. Let me go back here into Bavinck's text. And we have in the paragraph this idea. Bavinck says, in more recent philosophy, this rationalism surfaced in Descartes, who found his fixed starting point in thought, and from it inferred being. Now, this is the famous Latin phrase, cogito, ergo, sum. I think, therefore I am. This is the classic statement, rationalistic statement. And so now Bavinck continues and says, with that move, logical necessity and coherence, the mathematical order of ground and consequence in the work of Baruch Spinoza became the standard of truth. So where can we step in reality? Where can we place our starting point and not have a moving, mutable, fixed starting point? What's an example of that? Well, Chuck, think of the old adage from Heraclitus that no man steps twice into the same river. The idea being that the first time you step into the river, it has a certain constituency, a certain essence. And then a moment later, you step into the same river, quote unquote, but in fact, it's completely different. It's all of the water that was in place at a certain place when you first stepped in has now moved, and there's nothing. There's no point of contact that is there in the second time you've stepped into that same river. So how can we avoid this? And this is the idea of this fixed starting point. So Descartes says that we're going to start with mind. We're going to start with the thinking human being. And from that, we have this idea that was almost all of modernity in some sense is informed by, if not some kind of expression of the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza. Now, I should say rationalist philosophy, but by and large, it's the mother's milk that so much of Western thought has been steeped in since his day. And so just taking some phrases here from Spinoza's entry over in Wikipedia. Now, Spinoza's metaphysics consists of one thing, substance, and its modifications, modes. And so Spinoza has this idea that there's only ultimately one substance, which is absolutely infinite, it is self-caused, and it is eternal. He calls this substance God or nature. And so the famous Latin phrase, Deus sive natura, God and nature. And so for Spinoza, the whole of the natural universe is made of one substance. And so, Chuck, when you go out into your garden and you take your backhoe and you start plowing for the season, and you start digging up your garden, why then, Chuck, you are disturbing God's substance. It's the same thing when I'm driving on the road and I'm interacting with the road. I'm interacting with the other cars. I'm interacting to move to the destination that I have to go. I am a part of the God system in Spinoza's mind. And this is going to be a key idea in so much of rationalistic thought. Now, Bavinck says this: the human mind is able to produce all knowledge from within itself with its own means by means of thought. Bavinck quotes Leibniz here, which says, our ideas, even of perceptible things, come from within ourselves. Fichte notes that there is no distinction between perception and rational thought. And so he states that all elements of our knowledge, even perception, are a priori and posited by the ego. And so this is called an absolute idealism. Now, Chuck, this is the beginning, in a conceptual way, of the modern enterprise. Now, right away, I'm struck by something. Fichte wants to talk about that our knowledge is in some sense a priori, and yet at the same point in time, he wants to talk that it is posited by the ego, that is to say, part of ourself. And so right away, there's going to be a big concern here. This is a core ingredient in the modern turn to phenomenalism or selfism, or this idea that the human observer is the principal knower, and everything else is built upon the relationship those things take to the human observer. Now, this is really difficult because right from the beginning, Chuck, Fichte is talking about knowledge being, and in this sense, objective and independent. We're speaking about a universe that exists independently of the perceiving self, I should say, the thinking self, and yet at the same time, it's posited by the ego. And so right at the very beginning is this conditioning. Chuck, how can we escape the glasses with which we see reality with? How can we escape our own thinking, our own thoughts? And so this turns from an absolute idealism into a subjective rationalism. So not only knowledge, Bavinck says, but also being, not just ideas, but the things themselves issued from thinking and being, thus are one. And we have a metaphysical idealism. Now, Chuck, this is really concerning because we were searching for knowledge before with this idea that knowledge is something associated with the human mind, which exists in the universe as an object. But now we've progressed in this modernism through this series of philosophical steps into this idea that thinking and being are actually unified, and they're, in some metaphysical sense, one and the same thing. And so thinking creates the form of our conceptual universe, Bavinck says, notes about thinking creates matter and content, Bavinck notes about Fichte, and then says this: thinking creates and constructs the entire world, not only the world of thought, but also being itself. Now, Chuck, what a step. We started off wishing to justify reasons and for explaining why we have knowledge of the universe that we ourselves participate in. And in some sense, we started from that humble spot, and following this path, we've ended up concluding that our thoughts represent itself being. Now, Chuck, I'm sure there's got to be, in your thinking, some really important concerns with that type of approach. Let me throw it over to you for some of the things that maybe you were thinking about when you walked down this path with Bavinck.
Yeah, first of all, in thinking initially about rationalism, before we walk down this path towards thinking and being one, there are ways, I think, to think rationally about thinking, to not be merely empiricist and not necessarily have to go all the way down there. To do so requires, I think, something that a lot of modern philosophers have been unwilling to do, which is to recognize what Francis Schaeffer calls the upper register, to recognize that there is something transcendent, there is something beyond. And it is interesting that even in rationalism, which proclaims that, that we need to have something beyond merely our senses to know, to understand, yet is unwilling to take that beyond a particular realm. In some ways, rationalism as travels that path that you've described through Kant and Fichte and others. In some ways, again, talking about that St. Louis Arch, still relies a little bit to some extent on the world of empiricism, of only recognizing that which can be perceived in some way. Now, clearly making thought about that, what matters. But there is a sense in which I think the world that we've gone down ignores the fact that there are these transcendent ideas and thoughts that can also be included in our process of thinking. For example, when Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," could he have been speaking rather not simply of a unity between thinking, but could we instead move to this idea of thinking being a reflection of the image of God, the imago Dei, and basically being a gift, a creative gift given to humanity that makes us who we are, that makes us different than the animal, for example. And so there is a sense in which, yes, we think, therefore we are human, but that is a gift to us. Now, there is a sense in which I think it does appear that in many ways, the idea of rationalism naturally goes to where it goes, once you get to, "I think, therefore I am," it is natural then to follow that path that Bavinck has described here into, creating and constructing the entire world, not only the world of thought, but of being itself as being created through thinking about it, its matter. And again, that reflects our unwillingness to go beyond. Now, if in fact rationalism naturally goes to that unity of thinking and being in a way that turns our human minds into the be all and end all, then there's a sense in which, well, maybe we need to reject rationalism. But of course, as we know, that's not where Bavinck ends up going here. He doesn't entirely reject the idea of rationalism for instead an empiricism. And in fact, we'll get to that in a little bit. There's still more here significantly more on rational as well. But merely questioning some of these assumptions of rationalism does not necessarily mean that, okay, well, so we went down the wrong leg of the arch, we got to go down the other either. It's really interesting how Bavinck takes us on this trip through sort of the history of rationalist philosophy, more in a descriptive manner so far.
Amen, my friend. Now, Bavinck has some words to say about idealism that it is not only representative of his own personal criticism of the various schools under this large umbrella. They're also fairly standard in the literature. And so Bavinck talks about, and we're getting into the beginning of 65 here, he says, in the first place, idealism, this kind of idealism, is contrary to all experience. And he makes this interesting statement, by nature, we are all realists, including, in practice, the idealists themselves. Now, here's the main criticism. Idealism, does not explain how and why every human automatically and spontaneously gets to ascribing objectivity and independent reality to the things perceived, instead of viewing them purely as inner states of consciousness. And Chuck, we've talked about this. If we had a graphic that we used in the lecture 2 years ago, and it was a young lady in a field looking at a tree, and remember, we had the thought balloon that came from her, and in the thought balloon was a picture of an image of the tree. And the idea with that picture was, as that young lady sits there and looks at that tree, and the tree enters into her mind, we see that we're looking at two different things. Now, the tree, the reality of it was not dependent upon her knowledge of it, but rather the knowledge seems dependent upon the already existing reality. And then second, there's been no explanation of how that actually has happened. What was the bookkeeping associated with the tree existing in the field that she's sitting in, and then the image coming into her mind? And so that process by which we can think about the things, the objects that are in reality. Idealism doesn't seem to actually provide any explanation here. At best or at most, it seems to presuppose that such a thing happens, but why should we presuppose that? And so one of the other interesting things Bavinck brings up here is idealism and rationalism in general has an epistemic or an ultimate difficulty. And that is to say, how could the thinking subject distinguish or discern between a dream or a hallucination and reality? Chuck, we grew up on that old nursery rhyme, row, row your boat gently down the stream, merrily, life is but a dream. Now, if the mind is thinking, cogitating, acting, how does it distinguish that it is in fact contemplating reality instead of, for example, a dream state? And so you have this idea. Think of films like The Matrix. Think of films like Inception that explore these ideas in different ways. So if thinking and being are identical, then we've got a real problem here. Now, the other criticism Bavinck brings is this idea that intellect is an instrument, not a source. Now, here's Bavinck's criticism. Idealism equates the organ of knowledge with the source of knowledge, as it were, making the eye into the source of light, deducing thought from the process of thinking. So imagine this, Chuck. Imagine if we started explaining the existence of light solely in terms of the impact light has upon the human eye. That would be, in some sense, backwards to how almost all of us conceive of the actual explanation for light. And so there is a difference between the thing and the representation of the thing. And therefore, this idea, being and thinking, to be and to perceive, are distinct and cannot be equated. Chuck, let me throw it over to you to reflect upon some of these and where this might leave the rationalist enterprise.
Well, it's really interesting. I was thinking about this as I was reading this, and it came to mind again as you were talking about, this issue where, the rationalists tend to equate the organ of knowledge with the source of knowledge. They tend to not be able to, in the end, they would have difficulty expressing the difference between what is actually real and what is a dream. And, there is a sense, I think, in which this idealism, this rational idealism is growing in popularity as opposed to empiricism, right? There was an empiricist reaction to rationalism, to idealism, to the 19th century German idealists. There is a sense, I have a sense that to some extent that is growing. It's growing in popularity. And one of the reasons, I think, is because there is a sense in which people are beginning to think, well, is there more to reality? Just think of the term virtual reality. Is virtual reality actually reality? I think there would have been a time when we would have said, of course not, right? That's not real. That's just things that you're perceiving, but it's not real. It's like watching television, or it's maybe a fancier version of it, but how is that actually real? And yet, I think there is a movement to this idea that, well, virtual reality is a form of reality. It's an alternate reality, but it's an alternate reality that has as much of an impact on us in the ways that we think as anything else. And so we can't ignore it. And, the transhumanists will take that even further, right? There's this sense that people are talking about this period of time, this moment in time when, we'll no longer need our bodies. We'll no longer need to live in the real physical world, but we'll be able to upload ourselves into sort of a virtual reality. Humans will become transhuman. They'll live in this virtual reality world, and well, that will be just as real. And so it is interesting that, I think there are those who regardless of religious belief, who want to push back against that. But there is a sense in which, if you take this rationalism, this idealistic rationalism to its natural end, you understand why the transhumanists believe that they just simply are they're just where we've been heading all along. And that's a concern. And so what Bavinck says here, not only does the world outside me become an illusion, the reality no longer is reality. It's just another illusion, no different than what's going on in my mind, no different than what's going on in this virtual reality. But then I myself also am nothing but a representation, a phenomenon to myself. Everything becomes a dream. There is no longer any reality or truth. And what's interesting about that is that, I mentioned before that, one of the alternatives potentially to realism and empiricism is skepticism, radical skepticism, that we can believe that anything really exists. But there may also be a path to that sort of radical skepticism. It's in a little bit of a different form. I take this idealism to its, complete end, where suddenly we are, well, what does it matter that we're made of stuff? We'll just virtually upload ourselves and live forever. And obviously I think there are a lot of concerns about that Christians would have, but really a lot of others as well. In fact, there was a sense in which I know you're a reader of science fiction as well. And for a while, it seemed like there was a lot of science fiction that went in that sort of idealist vein, that sort of expressed this idea that, in the end, we'll be able to escape the prison of reality and we'll become virtual and we'll live forever in that way. I am now seeing, to some extent, in science fiction, and I think sometimes science fiction is at the vanguard of certain types of philosophical thought, some real questions about whether that's a good thing, and whether, that there needs to be a sense of reality, whether there needs to be, at least in this world, some form of death and, entropy. And, there's no way that we can, just simply upload into these virtual realities. And, it's interesting. Bavinck had no sense of this stuff, I imagine, other than in the way that he's written it. He had no idea that, a little over 100 years after his death, that there would be people who very much believed in this idea of transhumanism and that kind of thing. But yet, in a way, you could see that some of the things that he wrote predict that and show that path. And again, that's another reason why, even though Bavinck wrote over 100 years ago, there's still so much there that we can gather from what he's written, and we can profit from reading what he has to say.